Hi, welcome to Oceania Rising, a program brought to you by Portland Community College, OHSU Employee Resource Group, the Oregon Pacific Islander Coalition, also known as OPIC, and the Washington County Cultural Celebrations Committee. We are here today to celebrate Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Month. Here today we have 3 members of the Oregon Pacific Islander Coalition, OPIC, who are part of a project called Oceania Rising, a project meant to explore the impacts a prescribed AAPI identity has had on Pacific Islander communities. Here to join us and discuss this project are the following panelists: Virginia Luca from Oregon Health Authority, Macarusa Portisano from Portland Community College, and OPIC Executive Director Alicia Mukasa. My name is Alicia Aquino, and I am with the Washington County Cultural Celebrations Committee. Before we start and learn more about our panelists, we do have some housekeeping to attend to. We are streaming live from 3 sources: PCC Sylvania's YouTube and the Facebook pages of OPIC, as well as PCC Sylvania. So welcome to all our viewers watching. During this presentation, we will have a series of questions for the panelists, and we'll also have an opportunity for those watching to ask questions as well. All the comments and questions in the comment boxes are accessible to our team via StreamYard, and we'll be highlighting various comments and questions for those watching. We are hoping to address most of the questions, but please be patient with us if we're not able to address them right away. Lastly, this event will be recorded on the sites you are watching them from, so feel free to go back and check any parts that maybe you missed later in the day. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and continue our program. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our panel to introduce themselves a little bit more. Mac, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Alicia. Hi, everybody. My name is Macarusa Portisano. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm currently the coordinator for the Sylvania Multicultural Center at Portland Community College. I sit on the OPIC Executive Committee and the Oceania Rising subcommittee. I don't know. We call it a subcommittee. I'm just going to make that up. Yeah. And also with a bunch of other organizations. So I'm the founder of the Pacific Islander Student Alliance Conference and organization PCW, Pacific Climate Warriors, and proud member and advisory board member for the Samoa Pacific Development Corporation. I don't normally name all of. I don't know why I'm doing it today. Maybe I'm nervous.
Name the power. Name it.
Name them all. We're on TV. I gotta shout out people, moms and pops and everybody. But yeah, that's who I am, and I'll pass it to Virginia.
Thanks, Mac. Ali, everyone. Hello. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Virginia Luca. I use she and they pronouns. My mom is from the island of Palau and my dad is white. I was born in Palau and then raised on Guam for 25 years before moving to Oregon 20 years ago. And like Mac, I've also served in a bunch of community organizations, including Utopia PDX, United Territories of Pacific Islanders Alliance Portland, the Micronesian Islander Community, Living Islands, and I was the program specialist senior for Pacific Islanders with Multnomah County, and now I'm with Oregon Health Authority. And so thanks so much for inviting us, and I will pass it on to Alicia.
Thanks, sis. Aloha, everyone. My name's Alicia Mukasa. Pronouns are she, her, hers. So I actually started in the Oregon Pacific Islander community organizing with Utopia PDX, which is an organization for queer and trans Pacific Islanders. And for a while, I was consulting full-time as a public health and health equity consultant, mainly for big government institutions, and then recently been given the honor to serve as the executive director of the Oregon Pacific Islander Coalition, which I'm so excited. Thank you, Mac and Alicia, for gathering us to talk about the work. And, in addition to those things, I also serve on Multnomah County's Public Health Advisory Board, and I am also on the Governor's Racial Justice Council for their Health Equity Committee. And I serve as a cultural health leader for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So we'll keep listing all the things we all do, But yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for being here today. It's good to meet fellow Islanders. So the first question is for Alicia. Can you explain what the Oceania Rising project is?
Yeah. So, I think what's important to name here is that there's been a ton of organizing going on for a very long time around Pacific Islanders trying to create space and specific movements for whether it's the broader Pacific Islander community or a really specific community that they come from where they serve, right? There's always been a history of powerful Samoan, Fijian, West Papuan, Native Hawaiian, Chuukese, Marshallese, etc., organizing happening here on the continent. But I think with everything that's happened with COVID-19, all of the recent conversations around what the importance and power is of data disaggregation and how that's just really at the forefront of a lot of conversations, we decided to launch this Oceania Rising project to also say, as powerful as a lot of the organizing has been, like we want to take it to the next level, like continue to highlight the history of our work and just really call for a shift in what the solidarity model and relationship looks like between the Asian American community and the Asian community, for example, and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Thinking about what coalition building and leadership actually looks like within Pacific Islanders, rooted in our value, rooted in recognition of our power and in the importance of self-determination for these different communities from Oceania. And this idea that, we're not really negotiating anymore, right? We don't have the space. We don't have the space to do that before or anymore. And what we really want to see is Pacific Islanders leading Pacific Islander movements. And so, our hope is to really form this campaign, this body of work that sure talks about data disaggregation, but also talks about what dissemination of power looks like, also talks about what real and effective coalition building looks like in solidarity with different communities that we may want to work with, and to continue to educate people on the breadth of what encompasses Oceania, and to also reassert Pacific Islanders in indigenous spaces, in decolonial spaces, because we always want to remind folks that when we're talking about Pacific Islanders, right, we're also not just talking about Native Hawaiians or not just talking about Polynesians or one specific group. When we talk about Pacific Islanders, we're talking about people indigenous to the largest water mass on the planet. We're talking about 20,000 plus islands and 30 plus Pacific Island nations. And we want everyone to know that each and every one of those communities, those dialects, those cultures, those histories need to be represented in work if we want to move the needle on anything, whether it's health equity, racial justice, decolonization. So our campaign is everything and anything in between, but that's a little bit of what Oceania Rising is.
Thank you. Virginia or Mac, did you want to add to that? No? Good.
Yeah, you did a great job. Thank you. Thank you, Alicia.
I was like, I hope I got it right.
That was everything.
I didn't want to close the space for anyone that hadn't know. So, all right. So, Virginia, what has the role of the AAPI Collective played in your life? And you can include the good and the bad too.
Yeah, thank you. I myself growing up as a Palauan and white person on Guam, I never really thought of myself as being quote unquote API, right? Or Pacific Islander. And I think it's because on Guam, I'm surrounded by Pacific Islanders. So if we walked around saying, oh, I'm a Pacific Islander, I'm like, you too, I'm a Pacific Islander too, right? We tend to really identify with our ethnic group. So as a Palauan person, right? We would spend time in the Palauan Abai. It's a Palauan meeting house, and we would go to Palauan cultural events. And my mom and sisters and I would speak Palauan to each other, and then English to my father. And so, even at school, when I go to school, I remember in elementary school, so many of the kids from the different ethnic groups, Filipino, Chamorro, all of us would kind of play with our own little group. And it wasn't until maybe middle school that I started to branch out and hang out with more kids who are, from across the Asian and Pacific Islander region. And when I moved here to Oregon, I realized that people would ask me, oh, where are you from? Because, looking at me, I'm culturally ambiguous, I have to admit. And so I would tell people that, oh, I'm Palauan. And they'd be like, what? You're what? I'm like, oh, it's an island in the Pacific. So I found myself kind of moving to the broader Pacific Islander category when talking to people to save time. Um, but it wasn't until I went to Southern Oregon University and I was part of the Hawaii Club there. And I got an invitation to go to a PISA conference, which is the Pacific Islander Student Alliance conference. That year it was in Corvallis at Oregon State University. And it was just wonderful to be surrounded by other all sorts of students from the Pacific Islander regions, from all sorts of colleges, and really understanding and learning the importance of knowing my cultural background, knowing my history, and it pushed me to learn more about um, like Palau and colonization um, and why culturally we do the things that we do. So it wasn't really until I moved out here that I really started to think about my identity as a Pacific Islander, as a Palauan person, as a queer Palauan person. Makes it even more complicated. And I was earning my degree in education and anthropology, and I would get a lot of people asking, "Oh, how many Pacific Islanders are there on campus?" And I'd be like, "That's a good question." And because of the way that we collect data, it's not always available. So many times, Asian Pacific Islander is one category. But if you really disaggregate it, typically what you'll find is there's more folks in the Asian American category than the Pacific Islander category. And I made that part of my journey to really understand where my people are in higher ed because I wasn't seeing a lot of Pacific Islanders, especially Micronesian folks. The Pacific Islander folks that I tended to see in higher ed were from Samoa or Tonga and or Hawaii. Actually, a lot of the folks that I met in Southern Oregon University, they were students who were from Hawaii, but not necessarily native Hawaiian. They were a large mixture of folks, but I feel like stereotypically people thought that we were from Hawaii. People thought that I would say, "Oh yeah, I'm a Pacific Islander," and they'd be like, "Oh, I love Hawaii," and I'm like, I do too, but I'm not from Hawaii." So it's been a lot of just reminding people that we are not a monolith, and to ask people like, "Why do you make an assumption that we're all from Hawaii?" And really pushing back and saying things like, maybe it's because of the media, maybe it's because it's a popular tourist destination, maybe because a lot of times our people are seen as entertainment, our people are seen as like asking questions, like people ask me questions about, did I live in a grass hut? Did I wear clothes? So all these really weird assumptions that people make about our lived experience. Um, and it's just amazing the stereotypes that happen and the questions that I get. It's like, what? Like, oh, they're like, "Oh, you're Islanders, so you should dance in the luau with us." I'm like, I didn't grow up dancing like that. My people don't luau, right? Like we have very different cultural styles. And so I think that the Asian Pacific Islander, like when I see that, in my research, it's really harmful for our Pacific Islanders because so many times people ask the numbers. Well, how many? How many people are there? How many people speak this language? Or how many people are hurting? I'm like, well, why don't you help me collect data in a way that I can get you the answer, right? So, um, and this is not new. Just aggregation is not a new concept, but we get so much pushback because of people saying it's too hard. It's too hard to change. And I'm like, well, where are your values lying? Right? Like you keep saying you want, to be inclusive. You keep saying you want to answer these questions and you keep saying you want to support us. Well, we're telling you how to support us. So, like Alicia said, we're no longer asking, like we're just going to go do it. Right? So, thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Virginia. A lot of what you said really resonated. I grew up in Guam too, so I think after moving away from such a long time, I wasn't used to like, "Hey, what village are you from?" It was more like, "What are you?" So thank you for sharing your experience with us. Mac, do you have anything to add to that about your experience?
Yeah, I think for me, I grew up in Portland, so my parents migrated here in the late '60s, early '70s, and really kind of fostered and grew the Samoan community that we know now. And so growing up, I had a strong sense of like, that was in Samoan community. And since there weren't a whole lot of us, like anyone that was an islander, I would just gravitate to them. I'm like, oh, you're Hawaiian? Come on, you're going to hang out with us from here on out. It's like that story of like BIPOC parents who can find their people in a Walmart out of nowhere, right? It's like, it's a skill I grew up having. Just like, I don't know, you islander, you islander, you islander, and you just start hugging, right? And then my parents always like, who are all these kids at our house right now? Like, oh, we found all the islander people. Gotta feed them. So, there was that, but that was in community. When you go into the institutions as a kid, so like higher ed and K through 12, it was normally just me and my siblings being the only Samoan people there. And then constantly having to be all those questions, both Virginia and Alicia said, like, who are you, what are you, and why are you? And it's just like, oh man. And just growing up, I brought into a lot of the stereotypes because I was longing for being visible, right? And the only islander people I saw on TV were pro wrestlers and football players. And so, you just tell everybody you're related to all of them. About half of it's true, but the other half, you just want to be cool and you want to be seen. But I just remember so much having to do that a lot growing up. I remember it was like 7th grade. My family had this like Polynesian Cultural Center VHS tape. And for young folks listening, VHS is a cassette thing you put in a huge box, and then it will play a movie or something on your TV. And you have to turn to channel 3 or 4 in order for it to work. But I remember bringing that to class, and it's like, oh, this is going to be the first time anyone saw me. And my teacher was like, oh, you're not the one dancing? And I was like, no. And I was like, well, I don't think we have time for this video. And I was just like, oh, shoot. So fast forward to like high school. Again, when I went to high school, I ended up being the only islander at my school. And I remember being really ashamed of being Samoan. Like, I was like, man, I didn't grow up speaking my language. I did grow up doing a lot of dancing. And all those things just kind of led to me leaving and moving to American Samoa. And, that it is something I would recommend all their parents do to their children, is to connect them back to Ocean. But it's a very hard mentally, spiritually trip to make because of imposter syndrome, right? I just didn't feel like I belonged in a place where nobody knew me. I didn't speak a language. I didn't know protocols. It's a very scary trip. And so I feel very privileged to have had, a community that fostered that told me like I belong back home. And that was through my church. So long story short, I came back, some 5 years later, and I felt very Samoan. I'm like, I'm in Portland. I'm gonna be the most Samoan student here at Portland State. I'm gonna do all these great things. And Virginia brings up a very good point about higher ed. I did a lot of dancing at Portland State, a lot of dancing, singing, performative stuff. And I was also very smart. I excelled academically. I was on scholarship. But those weren't the things people wanted to see from me. And then I realized very quickly, especially when my classmates from Samoa dropped out, that they didn't really care for us outside of the prescribed identity roles that they have for islander people. You either play football or you dance and sing. And that was very frustrating to me. I'm very lucky to have a mentor on campus, Dr. Toyutu Faleawa, Leafionga Yavui, who really fostered me. And the thing I have to say too is I although I was eager to be a Pacific Islander, I was in a larger API context at Portland State, and it was a very fostering community. I got into organizing with Apano in its earlier stages. We were one of the first. Me and my friends were like the first field organizer hires for Apano when they first restarted, and a lot of my leadership development and my organizing came from an API lens. And I was always the Pacific Islander in the group. and it felt like PSU a lot of the times. And luckily there's people there. My personal relationships were very loving. I made a lot of great friends who took me under their wing, but nobody knew anything about me, and I had to leave Portland again. When I decided to do my master's, I moved to Hawaii, and Alicia, that's how we met at Shamanon, because I just wasn't finding my place in Portland, and I knew if I wanted to do the things I wanted to be the version of myself, I was going to have to leave. And that's not the thing I want. It's something I share a lot in testimony, that I don't want to leave Portland. I have an 8-year-old daughter who's coming back next month from the Marshall Islands. I don't want her to have to leave to find out who she is. Everyone else that I work with, I'm not saying that it's isolated in Islander communities that people struggle to find their identity. I pray and hope and I will advocate and organize for those communities too, but they're far beyond what we have as Pacific Islanders. And this is why this project is so important, because our young people don't have the vessel to navigate ocean, and we have to create our own resources and gain our own power to do that, so that our children can find a way, living here in Oregon without having to move back to the island. I'm still going to send my girl home, but when she's here, she should still be able to function and see herself in schools and programs and in communities. So that's been basically my API life. I was going to move again. I tend to move every 5 years. I'm a navigator. I just go around. I move around. 5 years in Hawaii, 5 years in Samoa, 5 years in Portland. But speaking of API folks, Grace Lee Boggs, an important activist in the Detroit area, American Revolutionist. If you've ever seen that documentary, said something that struck me, and it was like, if you're going to be committed to the movement, you got to be committed to space. And so here I am in Portland, Oregon still, and I'm turning down these opportunities to move away because the movement needs us, and here I am.
Thank you, Mac, for sharing. I recently connected back with Mac probably like a month ago, and the very first question he asked me was, do you have community? So thank you for bringing me back into community with you all today, and I'm looking forward for more opportunities with you all. And last but not least, Alicia, can you share your experience?
Sure. It's interesting. So I grew up in Southeast San Diego, about 15 minutes above the Mexican-American border. So I grew up in community with actually a lot of Black and Chicano folks, and that absolutely shapes my experience. It's interesting because I am technically both Asian and Pacific Islander, and I've just always really struggled with how to find my place amongst both of those communities, because because of the stereotypes also against Asian folks, right? I was too dark, too thick, and too loud to be Asian, where folks are like, no way. But I'm like, man, I'm a kid from the hood. And that's really a defining part of my context and my foundation and who I am. And I think I really struggled with, and it was interesting because I was excelling academically, right? But also just really struggled with it. But no one ever thought that of me. No one ever thought that I was capable because of what my outward appearance was like, because they're like, well, you don't look like the rest of the East Asian kids who we think of as top performers in this class. Luckily, my teachers never treated me that way, but my peers certainly did. And so it's just, and then on top of that, also being queer, right? So I think one of the really interesting things about being part of the diaspora is that you're always in this in-between space, right? Virginia and I were just talking about it earlier this week. It kind of feels like you're floating out in space, trying to figure out, where do I plant my roots? What do I plant my roots in? What even makes me feel rooted in the most authentic of ways? But I will say, I was really fortunate that in the absence of having other Native Hawaiians to help shape me, I had Black folks. And that is core to my experience. And they never told me, right, that this is what I should look like. Instead, what they showed me was what their experience was, what their challenge was, and what their strength was in trying to define who they were in the context that we were all living in, right? Growing up as kids who had just the most challenging walks home, the things that we would see between school and trying to get back to, our apartment complexes, right? So it was really looking to those folks. And I got taken care of, while my parents were at work, by a lot of Chicano and Black parents, because those were the parents of my friends. So I think that itself, and I did a lot of health equity work. That's always been my focus. And that was my work right after college. I, went into a national public health policy organization. And it was interesting because a lot of racial equity work still focuses solely on the Black and or Latinx experience, which again is important work, but there's also a ton of other communities out there, right? And it's also racial equity is really limiting in how it even talks about Black folks or Latinx people. And so for me, it was really this whole journey about connecting to the API space has really just been about like, do we have the power, the resources, and the community to really carve out our own paths as contemporary Indigenous people, as children of the diaspora, as folks who may not even necessarily identify as Pacific Islander, but specifically as Palauan, Samoan, Native Hawaiian, Chamorro, etc. So, it's a complicated relationship, right? Because there's also a ton of personal trauma. There's a ton of institutional and oppression that's happened between our organizations and movements within this API umbrella. But what's important for me and like what Mac was saying, what's important about this work is that we really think of what a new and more effective model of solidarity really looks like, even within Pacific Islanders, right? And then also between Pacific Islanders and other communities, whether that's Asian folks, whether that's the Latinx community, the Black community, etc. So those are all the things that come up when we open up this conversation.
Thank you, Alicia. And maybe you can expand a little bit. So the next question we were going to ask is, why are we now asking, or should I say demanding, that we disaggregate?
Yeah, what I'll say is we've always known, right, that this is key. This has been like a core part of a lot of Pacific Islander organizing. But what I want to name is that I think COVID-19, it was devastating for Pacific Islanders. And one thing that COVID-19 really unveiled to the rest of the world that we as community already knew was there was a massive amount of structural erasure and institutional oppression that was happening. So now you have this global pandemic come and hit folks. And what it revealed was just the historical lack of investment that Pacific Islanders have received. And it was really interesting, right, at the start of the pandemic, where all of our different organizers were going and asking institutions for resources and support to take care of our people. Because it was a tidal wave, and it is a tidal wave, COVID, through the Pacific Islander community. They would come back to us and say, well, what happened to those resources that we shared with you all? And we're like, with who? Like, be specific with who? And what they would often reference is Asian Pacific Islander organizations. And the unfortunate reality of it is that, while a lot of those organizations have, in principle or in theory been in support, when we look at the actual distribution of power and resources, a lot of that hasn't actually trickled down to Pacific Islanders. And so what we're left with is, I always pull out this data point, especially in Oregon. At the time that COVID-19 hit Oregon, Virginia, from what we know, was the only Pacific Islander with a Pacific Islander specific public health position in the entire state of Oregon, right? And there is no way that Virginia alone could manage a global pandemic hitting a statewide, culturally specific population. So that is just one of many examples of why now it's time and we can't negotiate, especially because we're going to still deal with the pandemic and then also figure out how to recover from it, and then also address some of the longstanding needs of our community that tie into the reasons as to why we have higher hospitalization rates, higher infection rates, and unfortunately higher death rates. So that's one core part. The last thing I'll say is the other core part is because our people deserve it. And there are so many incredible things happening in the Pacific Islander community that folks don't see necessarily at all, or even if they do witness it, don't understand it as a worthy investment, right? But what I always name to folks is Pacific Islanders know how to serve Pacific Islanders best. When we talk to big institutions and they have a new racial equity initiative and they have now this kind of public charge to serve Pacific Islanders, right? They're scratching their heads. They say, oh, well, how do we navigate the historical mistrust and all of the different languages? And where do we even find this community? I'm like, well, Pacific Islanders already know that. And if you were to resource the existing community infrastructure, you would see a massive change in the work, right? And again, an example I'll give is Oregon Health Authority. They do a chronic disease survey called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. It's funded by the CDC. They take all of that information, and that's often what a lot of statewide public health divisions will use to guide their policies, programs, and investments. Because that survey is so culturally out of touch and its data collection methods, a stranger calls you from an unknown number and asks you personal questions. Now, I don't know about you, but my mom does not answer numbers that she does not know, right? And many of our community members, they're not gonna answer the call, let alone give you that sensitive information. So what happens is, because the methods and questions are culturally out of touch, we're not visible in this huge statewide data set, which means we don't end up getting the investments that we need. And I think that is directly connected to what the outcomes of COVID were. But when the health authority turned control over to our leadership, where we said, we don't want your researchers, we want to invest in building up our community leaders to be the researchers, to be the data collectors. We want to change the way we're collecting this information. So when the health authority was using their methods, for example, in 3 years of doing an intentional racial and ethnic oversample of Pacific Islanders, they got 3 years, 109 Pacific Islanders engaged for a statewide population. When we piloted our version of the project and said, this is about connection, this is about healing, this is about lifting up our specific cultures and needs, right? In 6 weeks, we got 200 engagements. Because that's where folks want to be. They want to be in community. And so I just think it's important to point out that data points of, we know how to do this work. And it's not about resourcing us so that we can figure out, oh, what's it like to write policy or do research? We know how to do that. What we need is for folks to get out of the way and to also trust and invest in our leadership so we can do the work. So yeah, I might have strayed already from the original question, but I always like to bring up those data points.
No, thank you so much, Alicia, for sharing. You brought up Virginia. So Virginia, can you elaborate more on your experience in this time?
Sure. Oh my goodness. So I went from Portland State University as a student activities and leadership programs advisor, where I was in that position for about 5 years. And then I got hired on at Multnomah County's Community Partnership and Capacity Building Unit, where I was the program specialist senior for the Pacific Islander community. And when I first started, I was amazed um, that I had to point out to the county that we had so many Pacific Islander led organizations. They didn't have a lot of those connections made. And so when I first started, we had $175,000 to do a Pacific Islander data project. And at first, they said, okay, so we're going to do a survey. I was like, hold on. Our people are tired of surveys. If you want people to show up, we need to do it. It has to be relational. We have to do some kind of, like getting folks together. This was before the pandemic. I'm like, we got to feed people, we got to celebrate. And so we started out with a celebration. We celebrated. I was like, yay, we have all this money. What do you Islander leaders want to do? And so we came up with a handful of topics that we wanted to explore, including chronic health, mental health and communication, sexual orientation and gender identity. Um, and and so we asked which organizations and which leaders wanted to be a part of it. And I worked with each organization to say, like, what do you want to explore about this topic? And so for all the topics, we had amazing Dr. Eileen Duldulau, who's an epidemiologist with the county, with Multnomah County. She was able to show us what we quote unquote knew, what has already been gathered about Pacific Islanders within some of these topics. And um, for the most part, it was really sad how little we could really say about our Pacific Islanders. And so the topics that we explored and the data that we did have access to, we did workshops where people came, they ate, we did um, a bunch of activities, and the leaders of these organizations helped me to create those workshops, and we compensated everybody. We compensated the organizations, we compensated all the islanders who came. It was so much fun, and we got so much wonderful information, and we created um, instead of having this like really huge report that was going to be shared about the project, we wanted to make sure that since this was for our community, for the leaders and members, we wanted to make sure that community members understood what was gathered and that they were part of the meaning making of all of it from start to finish. And what my priority was that we shared the information in a way that one was completely controlled by the community leaders and members, that they owned the data. So data sovereignty was really important to us. Alicia Makaisa and another one of our colleagues was able to meet with folks to try to figure out what does data sovereignty look like, and how should we be approaching this so that we can make sure that we own the data and that any kind of information and knowledge that was shared and gathered is shared in a way that we want to make use of it. So a lot came out of that project, that I'm just so proud of all the people who showed up, and then it went on to a Pacific Islander data modernization project that Alicia helped to lead, and that's how we came up with like, hey, we got things going, right? We want to train community health workers to be researchers. We want, like, we can do this, right? We should be focused on community-based participatory research from start to finish, not this like collaboration, like, I have a project for you. Will you join me? Right? Like, I already have it all figured out. It's okay. Like, no, we have to build it together, right? And so it takes long. It takes a long time. And 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 it's like it takes time because you have to like check in and double check, and does this feel good? And it's such an iterative process. And I love how we try to do things slow and methodical, and that understanding like yeah, we have deadlines, but sometimes they're arbitrary. And sometimes, things happen when they happen, right? And so, and having to like push back in institutions, because they're like, we need a report by this day. And we're like, yeah, that's not going to happen. but, but I can do this by this day, right? So just making sure that we're constantly honoring, the people who are helping us with these projects from start to finish. And even after that, the relationship is not over, right? It has to continually we have to continually say like, okay, like what's next? Because the last thing we want to do is collect data that's just going to sit in a shelf and collect dust that people are going to admire. No, we want it to affect policy. We want it to affect change. We want to tell our stories, from our point of views in our languages. And again, this is really new to some of these institutions. And we're here to show you what to do. So yes, sign up now. So thank you.
Virginia, I was just going to chime in real quick because we've been having those conversations about reports too, and what our like relationship with institutions or government looks like. And, one of the important things in a lot of the work that we're doing right now is, I've been pushing back a ton because, I have to manage a lot of the strategic partnerships that OPIC enters into. And I'm like, well, yeah, you could have a report, or you could be an active and present collaborator and supporter as an institution. So like this big 2-year project that we've been doing with the evaluation team at the health authority, like I'm like, there's no like formal report to them about what we did and didn't do, what the challenges were, because we asked them to be present the whole time. Because we're also like, we're not here so that you can contract out your community engagement and relationship building responsibilities. Like, if we want to see actual changes, you have to be an active part of the project, dedicate your time to it, and like be a part of all of it. And at times institutions are scared of that, right? Because they want to respect our space, which I always appreciate, right? And we always want them to be thoughtful when they come and meet our people. And at the same time, we're like, you have to be committed to transforming your relationship with our people if you want this work to be effective, right? And so, like Virginia said, the resulting work doesn't just sit on the shelf when like our technical point of contact can't explain or defend or commit to it themselves, like that's what's been really important to us, is active partnership, active relationship, and folks' commitment to that, to coming into a space, to learning about protocol, when to speak, what to say, how to really connect with our people. Like, we're like, we want that mutual accountability. We're like, we'll get the work done, but come and witness it rather than read about it in a report. Come and be a part of it.
Mac, did you want to share your experience or your, anything about why we should disaggregate now?
Yeah, and oh gosh, where do I start? So much has already been said. I think what I'll do is I'll stick to like the higher ed education realm where I'm at. And what we're seeing a lot is, for example, ethnic studies is becoming a growing thing in higher ed. And what we're advocating a lot for in different institutions, it was like, we got to get API studies. We got to get API studies. And then what the institutions will do is they'll implement Asian American studies or classroom classes and be like, we fulfilled the API requirement. And like in a lot of institutions, when that part is done, and most of the times they're leaning towards the demographics that show the most, which will always almost be Asian American, we get left out. And when we get left out, part of the reasons that disaggregate is to let people know that we exist, right? And that becomes very tough. Even, for me, working at Portland State, when I became the inaugural coordinator for their what was going to be called something really problematic, but basically it was an API center. We flipped it around. We're like, if we're working from an equity lens, let's call this thing something else. And so we ended up naming it the PS Centers, the Pacific Islander Asian American Student Center. But it's just small things like that where we get the opportunity to speak, that our people are finally being seen and heard. And it's not that like we need to disaggregate because none of this stuff is working. I remember working when I was a DJ on KBOO 90.7. It was a community radio. I had 3 Asian American women who were running a monthly program called API Compass. And it was really great because half the programs were Pacific Islander. There was a Tongan women's program. There was an Asian American theme program. And then there was my Pacific Islander music program, right? Like, so we know that there's a best practice for doing something like this coalition between Asian American and Pacific Islanders. But there's also been, sort of like malpractice, right? A malpractice, excuse me. API, and my understanding of its origins, was meant to be a political identity, right? A collection of Asian American Pacific Islander folks at a very specific time and place who are advocating to work together to drive new policy, new legislation, and new community building. The thing about community and coalition building is like people need to reconvene at the table. And those people who are at that table aren't the communities that exist today. So, I don't even, we can't even, there's nothing written like who was actually at the table for Pacific Islander people. And when we get to a place in our oral traditions and in our written history that we don't know who's at the table, we need to reconvene. And the problem with our reconvening is we've been left in the dust for so long, and we watched a lot of our Asian American counterparts, thrive while we're just here trying to survive. It's a call for our need for our own space. Our practice in coalition is broken down, and we need to revisit what it looks like. I'm very intentional about saying I'm not trying to dismantle the API coalition. We just want our space. And if we're going to do this thing right, we probably need to leave the table and then come back when, as a community, we're ready to re-engage in the conversation of what this political identity means. The other part about it that gets tricky is, we have to be careful about our narratives. API and the way it worked as a racial identity in public policy, right? That's part of the problem. We allowed someone to take control of this coalition narrative. We allow whiteness to come in and be the driving force of like what's going to happen with this community. We were never meant to be a racial ethnic group. There's no other pairing of two completely different groups of people with separate colonial histories that have been bunched together. Like when I travel the world, I'm like, yeah, I work with this API group, and they're like, what the hell is API? Right? It's nowhere else but here. And that's a very colonial tactic to around dividing and conquering. And also in the Pacific, we're very familiar with the large grouping and bunchings of communities. I mean, this is why we have 3 colonial regions: Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, and how the world understands ocean and how they speak for us. So getting back to the question of like disaggregating why we need to do that, is just like we need to find our voice. This project is about regaining control of our access to resource and our ability to control the power that's granted to us. Other people are controlling what we do. One of the things about being hired in the PETA Center, we're talking about controlling narrative, is a lot of API centers, only 2 of us were Pacific Islander in the entire nation. There are tons of API centers, student centers. Only 2 of us were hired, and one of them didn't even directly work in the center. They kind of worked in the overall stuff. Shout out to Sefaina. And then that's just mirrored of what's happening in public health, what's happening in elected officials, what's happening in any one of the institutions we exist in, that we're just consistently being left out and being counted as API. And the last thing I'll say is, me and Virginia are about to get ready to present at this national conference on race and ethnicity. And you talk about folks, controlling narrative. I don't know a whole lot about this gentleman, but, they wrote a book called Hapa, and, they made a pretty good living off this Hapa project. Not even being Native Hawaiian, not even being a Pacific Islander or engaging with this community, but feeling like, and a lot of Asian American people, state claimed on our language. Our language is already stolen. And now here's another group of community folks who are co-opting and benefiting from our language when our people can't even do that. So this is another reason why we need our own space. And I only have one more part. People forget too, in this API grouping, that it wasn't just white people who came and colonized our islands. We were colonized from both sides. And we still have a lot of trauma we need to unpack. And so a lot of our Asian counterparts also need to realize we still have a lot of trauma we're trying to get over from, those countries in Asia that came over and continue to colonize our people in our spaces. So we gotta think large, we gotta think deep, and we just want our space and our time and our power and resources.
Wow. Thank you all for sharing. You're all doing very important and powerful work out there in the community that's really, necessary. So we know the what, we know the why. Now let's learn more about the how. What are the next steps in this process, Alicia?
I think one of the things is really building up our data sovereignty practices, right? And our protocol, and really strong coalition organizing within all of the different Pacific Islander communities. Because the more of a united front that we are, right, as people, to say, no, this is how the work has to happen, where there's a real redistribution of power and resources and control over not just separating things out into these different racial and ethnic categories, but saying how we do that, why we do that, what the research should even look like, because we are a people of stories and storytelling, and the quantitative and the qualitative analysis is all equally important, and that we don't just want to be a part of extraction of information, but like leadership in like, what do we do with this information, right? So it's important that as Pacific Islanders, we're all organized around that, because the way institutions historically work with their divide and conquer tactics is, if one agency or if one organization or a set of people are too difficult, they'll just go and find someone else then who's okay taking kind of the crumbs of a project. And you know, and it's no judgment, right, to Pacific Islander organizations who do that. I understand why folks do that. It's because they need the resources, because they're doing really important work and need the funding, need the money, need the visibility. But in Oceania Rising, what we're trying to do is really show people that there is a different way, and that it's possible, and that one of the best things we can do is do this work together. And so I always tell folks that OPIC and Oceania Rising, we're not just about data disaggregation, right? That's one piece of the pie. We're about sovereignty and self-determination. And so when it comes to data, we don't want to just be a part of the group that says, okay, well, this is how you like look at the different categories. We want to say, well, this is how you spend the money on Pacific Islander research. You invest it back into Pacific Islanders, right? We had a huge budget from the health authority, and I made sure, like, based on Virginia's practices and the model that she set for us of like, rather than investing in researchers from other groups who already knew how to do that work, we're like, well, we're going to take our time and build up our own people to do the data collection. You know, we're going to actually have them, you know, train them on public health, on the social determinants of health, and then let them design the actual assessment tool. That's what we're going to do. And then when we engage in anything that requires any kind of research or, you know, or data collection from us, we're going to tell them, okay, and at the end, we own this data. We're the authority over this data. And so when you all want to use that data, it gets to go through our community leaders, and we get to be a part of the meaning making. Because even in instances where there has been an effort to do data disaggregation, we've also seen researchers take that information and run. And anyone who works in academia knows that that's a huge problem, because when you get published then as a non-Pacific Islander on Pacific Islander experiences, you get the social capital of becoming then the resident expert on Pacific Islanders, right? And we've seen it before. We've seen non-Pacific Islanders publish decolonial research on Pacific Islanders. And, you know, it always makes us scratch our head. We're like, do you know what decolonization means? And we're like, we think you just did the opposite. You took something that didn't belong to you.
You know who you are out there. Yeah. You know who you are.
For anyone watching out there. But, you know, so really that's what's next, right? Is like really building a really strong, united and organized front as Pacific Islanders, as Indigenous people, right? And saying, this is what we want the work to look like. But I'll say it takes a lot of time and resources to get to that place. We're still even relationship building within our communities, because a lot of erasure has happened even within this, you know, space of who's Pacific Islander, partially because of a lot of white supremacy culture, right? Like the narrative there that wants to oversimplify us and say, oh, well, all Pacific Islanders must be Native Hawaiian, or, you know, they only think of Polynesians, you know, and Melanesians and Micronesians, you know, are then erased from that narrative, erased from that power. So right now, what it requires is a ton of reflection, a ton of our community moving through their trauma and into this healing process, a ton of organizing, and I'm hoping that one of the first things that we can really centralize on is imagining our community, what data sovereignty looks like, who governs that effort, what resources it'll take, all that stuff. Thanks, Dr. Duldalau. We see your comment. And I think Lei was commenting earlier too. But yeah, you know, that's just the beginning of the to-do list, right? But, you know, I'll let Virginia and Mac expand for sure.
I just wanted to give a shout out to Maria Dizon. She was one of the folks who helped Alicia with the data sovereignty, and also Dr. Mike Spencer. Oh my gosh, just so many wonderful, amazing folks who helped us to understand some of these processes. And I love how, we get to I get to meet more folks in the community who are doing this, because too many times I think we assume that none of us are doing this work, right? It's like, actually, no, let me give you a list of people doing this amazing work, right? But like Alicia said, too many times other people are becoming known for doing this work, but you know, they're not from our islands, and they don't have that lived experience. No, you are amazing, Leila. And Dr. Duldalau is also a superhero for sure. Thank you so much. But it's just it just takes a lot of time. But I mean, but imagine how much time other communities have had to build this, right? Like they've had so many years to build this, and we're just now trying to do this. Um, and yeah, I mean, just Palau alone, right? Thinking about, we were colonized by Spain, Germany, Japan, the United States, right? There's a reason why my mom and her sisters have Japanese names. There's a reason why my mom could speak Japanese, Palauan, and English, right? And how um like we also celebrate New Year by eating mochi and eating long noodles for good luck. So many things are super ingrained, and too many times, right? Like growing up on Guam, I can't help but feel that um, it's like, oh, a white person said to do that. Well, they're probably really smart and we should follow them, right? Just too many times we set aside things that maybe come naturally to us, and instead of following our instincts, we follow the colonizer. Um, and our history of colonization is really different, right? While the Japanese were in Palau, I feel like, in Guam and Saipan, there's still elders who are alive who remember their family being pushed off cliffs, right? And being killed in the villages by the Japanese soldiers. So sometimes when they see Japanese tourists, they will be upset with them because they have this memory. My mom was 4 years old and was forced our family was forced to stay in the caves by the Japanese soldiers, right? During World War II, and the Japanese soldiers told us that the Americans were there to kill us. So there's still that lived experience in our blood, in our roots, and I just I didn't know these things until I came to the States. I didn't know these things until I went to college and I was trying to understand, like, why does my mom have a Japanese name? Why, I thought the Japanese words that we Palauans were using, I thought they were Palauan. And my teachers, they were like, no, those are borrowed words from Japan. I'm like, oh, that okay. Right. Like just constantly learning. And I think that is why we need to really understand our history, and tell our stories. But that means, making sure that we are making space for folks to be able to share their story and for someone to listen and to actually take action. I'm so proud of all the work that our community leaders have done in the past few years, especially during a pandemic. Oh my gosh, right? Like, it's just amazing to me, that so many of our organizations went from fully volunteer led people who were working full time jobs, and then doing their community service, right, with their organizations, to getting enough funding from our local, state, and county officials to be able to actually hire community health workers, hire executive directors, hire staff so that we can serve our own folks. In the beginning of the pandemic, I got so many questions about, why are your people so sick? And it's like, it's just so heartbreaking, because we did have such high rates of infection, hospitalization, and death. So many of us personally lost family, in our communities, due to COVID, and I'm really just just so grateful to our community organizations who stuck it out, who have had very little rest, and they continue to do community, testing and vaccination sites. They continue to make sure that our elders and our youth are, given the things that they need in order to, and in their languages. I think that is like amazing that we were able to print so many COVID documents and COVID education in our different languages. It's not enough to just have something in English that was written from a very white, perspective from the CDC. My mom's going to read it and be like, "What does this mean?" Right? We have to make sure that it's all culturally relevant. But in order to do that, we need to know who's here, and to know who's here, we need to disaggregate. So it's like all roads lead to making sure that we are highlighting everyone's experience, especially with Pacific Islanders. Some of us are U.S. citizens depending on where we're born. Some of us are U.S. nationals depending on where we're born. Some of us are COFA state citizens, Compact of Free Association folks, and there's like various degrees of what you have access to or not. And so if we don't know who you are and what you're needing, then how are we going to inform programs and policies? So thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. So, Mac, do you feel like the AAPI term is still needed, or like what do you think happens to it?
Yeah, I think thanks for the question. It's a very important question. One thing I noticed is the need for these kind of coalition groups. They're very localized. In higher ed, we have centers who are like API, there's APITA, there's the PIA, there's just Asian American. I think the whole thing is to be intentional around, why you're in this collective community agreement. And then there has to be an agreement, like I mentioned before, about like being at the table. We just got to understand what people want and what's going to work best for them. API might be the best thing for, I don't know, Salem, Oregon, right? But it might not work here in Portland. But the whole idea is that people get to control like what is best for their community. The one thing that I worry about, like when we're like, let's break this thing up, is because we've had the idea of like this collective solidarity, although a lot of it wasn't pushed by us. This is not going to be the only other community we build coalitions with. And I think if we can find a way to navigate through this, we're going to be able to find ways to, do the coalition work between, you name it, Pacific Islander and Black communities, Pacific Islander and other Indigenous communities, Pacific Islander and the Latinx community. So, it's not that we can't learn from, it not being around anymore too. There's a lot of things to consider, but I think the part is to not to think so brash and to really think about both the long-term and short-term effects of what this could be. But the bigger part, you asked the question, like, what are the next steps in the process? Is not just about like what kind of policies we put in place, it's the practice. And so Asian American communities who make money on API funding, they have to have a practice of finding ways to get that money to Pacific Islander people. You can't take funding from an API source and not give anything to the PI part, of those funding sources. You can't run API leadership stuff and then don't have any PIs in there. So it's not only that we need API, we need folks to think collectively. And if they keep this up, and if we can collectively keep doing things this way, and we want to do API, we're going to find that Pacific Islanders are going to leave Asian American folks out. And that's not the model you want to leave or have if you're agreeing to a collective coalition grouping like this. So I still think it needs to happen. It doesn't have to happen now. And I'll give an example. I was asked to be a part of an organization's board. And they're like, Mac, we could really use a Pacific Islander voice. And I thought long and hard, and I talked to my mentor, and I said, no, the thing is too, like we have a lot of internal building we need to do. Pacific Islander communities aren't organized in the way a lot of our Asian American communities are. We have nothing to leverage or ask for at the table. And the reason why I felt like we needed something to leverage is because when we show up, we're left behind. And just thinking yeah, politically, we need to do some more internal work, and that's happened over the last 5 years. And like Alicia and Virginia alluded to, COVID kind of sped things up. When people were dying, getting sick, and getting hospitalized, and our people were disproportionately the ones being sick and dying or hospitalized, the state had to wake up, and so did our partnering orgs. So, is it still needed? I think so. It doesn't mean we have to reconvene now. We might need to separate and then reconvene at a different time. But we're exploring all those options, what it could look like, and we need to have these conversations too with our Asian American organizations, that especially those who benefit off of these funding cycles that might not be giving the money to Pacific Islanders the way that they're meant to be, or spaces and community groups that aren't holding space for Pacific Islanders the way they're meant to be. And we're not the only ones, right? In AAPI, we got a lot of Southeast Asian folks who don't have a voice. We have a lot of South Asian folks who don't have a voice. And then we have a lot of like these communities that just are invisible. It's tough to maintain a coalition of this size and that proportion. We need to rethink how we participate in this.
Yeah. Virginia, do you want to add to that?
I definitely echo everything that Mac just said. When you think of Asia as geography, that's half the planet, right? Like it includes Russia. Right? Like, so it's like, where does it end? Right? Like, who are we leaving out intentionally or not? And um, yeah, I always question, like, are folks who are, Lao getting services? Are folks who are, Burmese, Cambodian, like all these, right? Like, are they actually getting services, or are they also being left behind? People who are from areas that are not quote unquote a country, right? But they may be like, mountain people of what is currently, Vietnam or whatnot. Like how do we make sure that everybody gets included if we're trying to pack everybody into this Asian Pacific Islander category? I think, if an organization does use it, I think they have to be extremely intentional about why are they using it and how are they using it, who are they leaving out and why, and maybe if they're realizing that they're leaving people out, then um, anytime I'm working with a community organization, I'm always asking them to be, and helping them with strategic planning or anything like that. I always have them go through, like, what are their values and mission? What are they trying to do? And are they actually doing what they're saying they're doing? And if not, that's okay. You can change things, right? Like, nobody asked us if we wanted to be a part of this category. Nobody asked us who's Polynesian, Melanesian, or Micronesian. Someone else figured that out for us, right? Nobody asked us, where does the Philippines fit in all of this, right? I feel like that is such a huge topic in the community because some people leave them out and some people don't. And to me, it's like, why? Right? Like, anywho, this could be a whole class. But I just feel like language should be intentional. Language is constantly changing, right? And we shouldn't just hold on to something just because it was created and it's there, right? Like, I'm always about trying to make sure that the language that we use is intentional. Names are important, right? Names are important for a reason. We name something, and it has, like, the intention around it. And so if we continue using it, I ask why. Like, why do we need to keep using it? That's me. Thank you. Aw, thanks, Stacey. So sweet.
Thank you, Virginia. Before we get to Alicia to answer her, to get her take on that, I do want to offer up this space. If any questions or comments, please leave it in the StreamYard and we will post that. We're getting towards the end of our presentation, so feel free to ask away. So Alicia, what do you think happens to AAPI, and do you feel like it's still needed?
Yeah, I will say I'm still trying to figure out what my answer is to that question, right? But in the beginning, and because I was a part of a lot of national Pacific Islander spaces too, in the beginning of COVID, at least, I was really bent on this idea of like retire it, like it's done, like dismantle it completely. And it was actually being in community with Mac and Virginia and the other folks at our coalition where I really started to think about this shift and, you know, listening to Mac and his organizing experience of like what it looks like to build a healthy and supportive coalition and a real collective movement. So I'm still exploring, right, what that looks like. What I will say at the same time, though, is that a lot of institutions are lazy. A lot of institutions don't understand equity. And so what's been really important to me is that as the coalition kind of steps into this limelight, right, that I always tell institutions, do not put it on me to do your work. Do not put it on OPIC to do your work. Like, we're not going to be your catch-all umbrella organization for Pacific Islanders either. That is not our purpose. Our purpose as OPIC is to support any Pacific Islander organization that wants to be in community with others, that wants to engage in a healing process, that wants to learn from one another. Like, that's ultimately what our function is, to support one another, not to do an institution's work. So when an institution is talking to me and they say, well, we want to engage with Pacific Islanders, I always throw it back at them. Well, who and why specifically? In what part of the state of Oregon? Which specific Pacific Islander community? Because they all respond to services and need really different things, right? And different things work for these different communities. So, you know, I put the question back on them because we're not here as their contracted community engagement entity, right? And I think that's been the challenge too with some of the API organizations is I recognize that a lot of them have been put back into that corner, right? And been then like the contracted community engagement body. And I'm like, no, you're not doing that to OPIC. Because then that creates ripples of harm even within our Pacific Islander community. If we're like, okay, yeah, we're okay being the one Pacific Islander organization that gets this contract from the state. And then now it's our responsibility with very little resources to suddenly gather all Pacific Islanders. So I always enter into these relationships with major white dominant institutions saying, we can be one of many. But what's your plan to engage other folks? Because there's also a ton of Pacific Islander organizations, one that we simply don't have the capacity to engage yet, who haven't found us or who have actively decided, no, we don't want to work with OPIC right now. We want to lead our own organization. And all of those things are perfectly fine. So I always put it back on folks. And, you know, the interesting thing, right, about a lot of coalition organizing, the whole concept is power and numbers, right? Like that's a core part of it. And I do think that's important. But I also tell institutions, I'm like, we shouldn't have to assemble thousands of people together, hundreds of people for folks to get access to what is their right, like healthcare, like housing, like quality education. So, you know, I also tell them, I'm like, I don't care if it's, you know, 3 Marshallese people in Union County. If they say they need services, right, we got to invest in that. We're not going to wait till, oh, well, now there's 100 folks who say they need it, right? Because also, if you care to learn the history of our migration, why we're separated from one another, why it's difficult to find community or why it can be isolating, like those are all like racial equity issues. Those are all issues around colonization and oppression. So I really push back on folks of like, well, the whole thing about equity isn't that we listen to like what a majority of folks want. Like that's not how it works. We're trying to find those pockets of people who continue to be invisible, right? And so it's also us pushing back on a lot of these Western data practices around suppression tools and statistical significance. We're like, I always tell folks, I'm like, okay, well, if there are 3 Marshallese people or 3 Chukis people, for example, in Union County, there's more than that, by the way, but let's say there's 3 people. If one of them passes away from COVID, that was 33% of that community's population. You can't tell me that's not significant, statistically significant. So there's just all of these really intentional conversations we have to have. And it's really important that we don't try to adopt, you know, Western frameworks or normative practices to do this work, right? And say, oh, well, it'll only be taken seriously if there's this many people. Or, you know, it's this big of a show or production. Or like, people should just get the things that they deserve. And, you know, that's what we're here to say. So, you know, again, I'm not sure what the future of that term is. And I think us being able to have that space to explore what we want it to look like, what it means to us, is really critical. Like, that's the first step. And again, continuing to put responsibility on institutions to do their work, and continuing to create OPIC as a space for healing and connection, you know, something that really hasn't been present for us on the continent for a very long time. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Alicia. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to do that right now. I have one more question to ask, and I'll start with Mac if we have some time. Mac, if Oceania Rising works the way we want it to work, what kind of world do you feel Pacific Islanders would be living in?
I think I don't know, like we're in some very like pivotal stages, but I think what Oceania Rising does and what it creates is, it is like the beginning point of like this transition. I think something Alicia said like resonated with me, and you know, one of my thoughts too is around like the previous question, like, do we need API or not? We're not going to wait around forever. If this isn't working out and it's not beneficial to our community, deuces, right? But the important part is we're the ones controlling that narrative. And so the truth can be told that we've done everything we were supposed to do, that we could do within our power. And, you know, maybe that's why things didn't work out. But we're not going to wait around and watch our people drown when they need resources. And then the other thing around, you know, what this will do is I think it just opens up the gates for a transition into resources that are ready and available for our community. It looks like our CBOs are being funded finally with money that's, you know, that's meant for them. There are Pacific Islander channels of funding that are meant for them. You know, Alicia and other OPEC folks are working on the Pacific Islanders Student Success Plan. Well, maybe there'll be one for healthcare. There'll be one for, you know, access to education. There'll be one for, you know, all the things that we know all our communities are getting. That there will finally be one for us, where the conversation will finally start, where Pacific Islanders are at the table to negotiate those things. So it's not going to solve everything. I think what it is, it's getting us to the table to have those conversations and moving people out, so that we're the ones speaking for ourselves.
Thank you, Mac. Virginia, would you like to take a little poke at that question?
Sure. I definitely think that it's the conversation starter. It's a chance for us to revisit our history, and try to understand why we have this term, and how it has been helpful for us and how it has been harmful for us. We don't pretend to know all the answers. We're not here to make these decisions for everybody, but we want to gather the people so that we can have folks share, you know, like, this is their experience. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot by being part of this project. And that's what I'm excited about, right? The people coming together, us making sure that we don't want to keep seeing the same Pacific Islander leader faces at the, you know, at the, right? We should be seeing more people. We shouldn't have to wait around for an invitation because somebody forgot about us. Too many times I've been invited to something because they're like, oh no, we don't have a Pacific Islander leader. Okay, can you call Virginia to see if she'll jump on this thing real quick? Like, we shouldn't be an afterthought, right? Like, we should actually be on, like, okay, you know, like, are people here? And, you know, making sure people understand that, you know, when I show up to a space, I can't speak for all Pacific Islanders. I can't even speak for all Palauans, right? Like, we all have different lived experiences. Um, you know, I think one thing that I would love, you know, like, long term are, you know, things like people on Guam should be able to vote for our president. Okay, right? People who are coming from American Samoa should not have such a hard time, you know, with their, it's just, that's what I hope for in the future, right? Like, that people understand, you know, the harm of overthrowing a kingdom in Hawaii, right? The harm that has been done to so many indigenous folks, or, it's that's what I hope, gets, us sharing our stories and people really understanding us. I feel like the more people who understand us and our stories and how we've been harmed and traumatized, and that we still carry a lot of that generational trauma, that people will say, huh, let's find ways to fix this and start the healing process. That's what I'm hoping for, honestly. So thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Alicia, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. I mean, you know, some of the things I would love to see as an outcome from Oceania Rising, but from this movement, right? So it's going to be this this long, never-ending thing. Is I would love to see so many Pacific Islander organizations, right? That once we even get into a specific Pacific Islander community, right, like Native Hawaiians, then there's so many different aspects of Native Hawaiian identity that there's so many different organizations for that, right? A queer Native Hawaiian organization, a farm workers Native Hawaiian organization, so on and so forth. That's what I want to see, just like such a heavy plethora of our presence in organizing that folks are like, I don't even know where to go and where to turn because there's just so much to work on, so much to do. I think that's one of the more near-term things. I also want to be able to see our different. I want to see folks when they enter into these API spaces, whether or not they're Pacific Islander, to question why there is no Pacific Islanders, right? I want to see that kind of solidarity where folks are like, we have to pause this conversation because look at who's at this table. We don't have any Pacific Islanders here. And unfortunately, that really hasn't happened yet, right? Like we've had to kind of intervene on our own and say, wait, you're having a conversation about Pacific Islander students with an all Asian committee? No way. Like we're going to pause that conversation and say, let's recalibrate, let's reframe. I think one of the core pieces, especially around data, is what I want to see is a lot of both academic and government institutions transform their data collection practices to include not just the way things are disaggregated, but data governance, to make community validation a core part of data. So they say, so that they understand that it's not just numbers, especially to Pacific Islanders. And if we want to do this work justice, there has to be context, there has to be story. The community must be able to see what information we're putting out there, because ultimately to decision makers, this is what tells them the narrative, or this is the starting point for that narrative for what they need. So those are some of the things that I'm really excited about and that I know we're going to do and make happen because we have incredible, intelligent, powerful organizers here in Oregon.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you all for being here. It's just so great for me personally to just learn more, like coming into this space. I'm with Washington County and I'm part of the AANHPI committee. And so even I'm guilty of not really knowing everything that's in that. As Virginia mentioned earlier, you get so used to just saying I'm Pacific Islander instead of saying like I'm Chamorro or I'm Palauan or I'm Samoan. And so I feel a little guilty in kind of like hindering the work too, because I don't name myself. And I think a lot of it is just not feeling like I'm seen. And so now, like hearing all your experiences, I understand how important it is for us to name where we're from and to show up at the table. So thank you for all being in this space, and thank you for allowing, us to spotlight all the great work that we're all doing in the community. And now that I know where each of y'all work, be expecting a phone call if I need some presentations, because I think that's important too, bringing in, resources from fellow Islanders into our own workspaces to share those experiences. And with that, we are closing. We're good to close. If any questions, I don't see any questions in the StreamYard. We're good. Happy Friday, everybody. Enjoy the nice Friday. It's sunny out here where I'm at, but hopefully it's sunny out there too.
All right.
You, Mac.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Alicia Aquino, for helping us do
Yes,
all
thank
this.
you.
Yeah,
Yes.
special thanks to you.
Yeah, we'll
Thank
continue
you.
to bother you, invite you to all the barbecues.
That's right.
All
Gotta
the
feed you.
Community.
Yes, you have to. You know where to find me.
Yes, yes.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so
All
much.
right, thank you.
Bye, folks.
Bye.